Welcome to the Canadian Homeschooler Podcast, where we have real conversations of all things homeschooling from a Canadian perspective. I'm your host, Lisa Marie, and today I'm joined by special guest Ary Maharaj from NEDIC, the National Eating Disorder Information Center. So grab your favorite drink and come join us on the couch. So first, I want to thank you so much for joining me today because I really appreciate you taking your time out to help me share some information that's very personal and dear to my family and that I think is really important for everyone to get out. So my first question is, can you just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are and the organization that you work for.
Cool. Hi everyone. My name is Ary Maharaj. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Outreach and Education Coordinator at an organization called the National Eating Disorder Information Center. We're a bit of a weird organization in how we are put together. So we're a program of the University Health Network Center for Mental Health, and we're based out of Toronto, Ontario, in a tertiary care hospital. But when NEDIC was founded in 1985, it was at the time in which public health messaging and information wasn't fully amalgamated into the Public Health Agency of Canada, which is where a lot of people get that information now. And what that means is NEDIC has a national scope, even though we're based in a province. And a lot of the work that we do gets to talk to Canadians from coast to coast to coast, really focused on supporting people with eating disorders, whatever that looks like for their individual situation. And for me in my role, the prevention of eating disorders. How do we create body inclusive environments where people feel accepted and respected? And that includes in education and that includes at home.
Yeah, perfect. So I guess I just to share with the listeners a little bit about our story. I have 5 kids and my oldest child never ate well. Like, I have no idea how he's still alive. He survived off of Cheerios for most of his life, Cheerios and candy. So I was always really worried about him because that, is not a typical food intake for children.
Mhm.
And in the process of paying so much attention to him, I missed kid number 2. And kid number 2 ended up being hospitalized with extreme low body weight and food intake being terrible. He was like 85 pounds at 6 feet tall. So they were very worried about him. And so we've discovered an eating disorder called ARFID, which I know isn't typically known within the eating disorder community. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. But it gave me a lot of awareness about how, specifically as a homeschool mom, you know, a little bit we feel like we sheltered our kids a little bit, so maybe they won't get that exposure. And so for our experience, that was nothing to do with exposure with body image or related things to that, because this was just about food intake. And so that was an interesting information for me. And as I've been sharing our story a little bit, and he's okay, I will mention that my child is okay for me to share his story. He gave me permission for that. Just some of the challenges that came up with that is that I've discovered other people. There's a lot of families that struggle with eating disorders. I don't know if COVID bumped it up to crazy levels or what, but it seems like everybody I know has somebody they know that's got an eating disorder challenge. So I guess one of my first questions I thought we should talk about is just like, what are the most common misconceptions about eating disorders in general?
Yeah, well, first I want to thank you and your son for permission and sharing the story because I think it hits a few things home. Like in terms of misconceptions, I think one is just how common eating disorders are. I think at NEDIC we've been really trying over the past couple of years from the pandemic and beyond to really send the message that eating disorders are everyone's business. I think
Mm.
once you actually get to know someone in a similar way to you, Lisa Marie, I feel like people have shared that they do know someone who's been touched by it in some way. It might not always be the like formal diagnosis, it might not be fully like seen by a healthcare provider, but an eating struggle, a body image struggle, a bit of both. All things that have happened. The public health statistics that we know right now are somewhere between 1 in every 3 girls and 1 in every 4 boys, ages 12 to 25, have struggled with disordered eating at some point in their life. So that's a massive amount
That's
of people,
huge. Yeah.
And I think what can sometimes make it really hard and leans into misconception number two is that I don't know that there's many other health conditions that are out there that have the pure amount of, I think, like misinformation that exists about it, in
Mm.
that like everyone in the world has an opinion on food, weight, and shape. And so therefore, I think the opinions about food, weight, and shape can make itself really pronounced that can directly impact why someone might choose to not feel comfortable sharing their story or not feel comfortable speaking out that they're actually struggling with a thing because there's a lot of like, I think sometimes well-intentioned, but like judgment-laden comments just by like us navigating society,
Mm,
being we all have to eat, we all have a body, so we all navigate our experiences in both of those ways. I don't think that's like true for every single other health condition. And so I think like that milieu makes it a bit hard when people are trying to navigate eating disorders for what they are. That leads to misconception number three. It's the last one I'll talk about right now, at least. I'm
mm.
sure there will be more chance, but I think that binge eating disorder is actually the most common eating disorder. And so a lot of people, when we think of eating disorders, I think we think of a certain type of person. We think of often someone with anorexia nervosa, someone with maybe like a smaller body type, what have you. Yeah, binge eating disorder is the most common, and people can experience anorexia nervosa even in larger bodies. That's actually more common than people, so I think, media depiction of the really small person with anorexia. Obviously, all of these experiences are valid, but I think it's just to say that I think the media perception of an eating disorder and what people actually go through is quite different. And I think RFID, as we will talk about more, I imagine, is like one of those things that's like, oh my God, I can feel so much relief from a
Mm,
parent when they're able to actually say, oh, that's what my kid's going through. It's a real thing. It's not just picky eating. Like there's
mm.
something actually going on. And that can be really empowering, I think, for both the person affected, but also their family.
Yeah, maybe we can talk a little bit about some of these different disorders, because I know that they're all different, and it's interesting how they all play out. Like interesting in a curiosity way, not in a good interesting way.
Yeah, I feel like when I'm thinking or giving education about eating disorders as diagnoses, there's a few things I think I'll say. Like
Mhm.
one of which is that the diagnostic criteria that are often used are from something called the DSM, the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Conditions. It's something that's primarily used in North America. Around the world, another classification tool, which is called the ICD, the International Classification of Disease, is used. Um, all of that to say is that I think when these tools were being created, they were being created by medical professionals to be able to like use language to get to talk about a constellation of symptoms. And I don't know if they were ever intentioned to be part of our like public conversation.
Uh,
Obviously, that has happened. And so, like, I think it's good that we get to talk about diagnoses, but I'll give the full caveat that I think it's important for people to know, especially when it comes to eating disorders, that there's like this big pervasive stereotype from people directly affected that are like often told that they're not sick enough to get help. We live in a healthcare system whereby there isn't the full resources available to give treatment to everybody. It's like a travesty that it is, but what that means is then hospital-based care often have to have criteria by which someone is more sick and that's who gets services. And some of the diagnoses then have now been used to say, okay, cool, you're more severe, let's give you service. And it means that someone who could also have been probably just as sick and just in need of deserving of care haven't been able to access it because they might not have had a diagnosis. And so
hmm.
I say both of those things just as caveats before getting to talk about diagnoses because I think it's important for families to know that just because you might not have it, it just might actually be the healthcare system's issue of not having resources to give people access to diagnoses that can limit care, not because what you're going through isn't like legit or in
Yeah.
need of support. That makes sense for everybody.
It makes sense for me. So from our experience, I can see that. We didn't have a diagnosis when my child went to the hospital. It was literally your heart
Yeah.
is probably going to have a heart attack. You're 15. We need to put you in hospital. So okay.
Right.
It was later we got the diagnosis for food related issues. So
Right.
mhm.
And yeah, and I feel like ARFID's a really good example, like a way for me to walk us through it because I
Mhm.
think, like you've noted, there are like some eating disorders that are some more body image based and some that have like nothing to do with body image at all. And so like ARFID is a eating disorder that rarely has anything to do with body image. There's just limitations in the amount or type of food that someone is taking in.
Yeah.
And there's not really kind of distress emotionally about it, but there's distress in the food intake process. And the worries, obviously, from a medical place is that if that happens to kids, especially while they're in growth, it can really delay growth or their development or impact their health or the strength of their bones and their organs and really important things. as a feeding concern. As like some that are a little more body image based, anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder. Um, Anorexia is really often around the like fear of gaining weight, the fear of fatness, the often leading to a lot of restriction of food intake. Sometimes even from a place of people think that like that's the message we've gotten from society, that body size equals health, even though that's not true.
Mhm.
So people with anorexia, I think, can have a really hard time of having internalized that message and now feel like they're doing the healthy thing of watching what they're eating, but now it's gotten into a point where they're restricting their food intake to the point of dizziness, fainting, avoiding social situations because of food, avoiding body cues of feeling hunger to the point that now your body like forgets what that means, those sorts of things. With bulimia, you both have the restriction that you see with anorexia, and then there's a compensatory behavior that follows. So maybe someone will eat something, but now they have to get rid of it somehow. And there can be through many different means. Yeah, there's lots of different ways I think that people can purge. Often I think the media stereotype is around like vomiting and what that looks like, but I think there's lots of other ways that that can happen. Um,
Mhm.
Laxative use, excessive exercise, things like that.
Yeah.
Binge eating disorder is where you really see binge eating, which is like eating a large amount for you in a small period of time for you and feeling really negative about it afterwards and that loss of control that results from it. So people often
Mhm.
experience shame or distress or guilt. I say the for you because I think like depending on our lifestyles, it makes sense sometimes for some of us to like have to eat more than other people. And I also think it's important that I think we've like often heard messages that I think really pathologize like comfort eating or emotional eating when I think like it's natural that food can be a source of comfort culturally or spiritually or in our family or at a time of celebration or whatever. I don't think those are binge eating episodes or whatever like that. I
Yeah.
think that's just people enjoying food in the way that they want to, but it's you're eating a lot, small period of time, you're feeling out of control while doing it, and you feel really negative emotions with it, but it
Mhm.
feels like uncontrollable. It feels like you can't stop. I feel like
Mhm.
those are some of the clusters of the primary eating disorders. But I think, like you mentioned, there's lots of other conditions here that we can talk about that fall underneath this cluster. And the NEDIC website has more information about it in case people who are listening want to check it out.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I will say that one of the things that has been insightful for me is realizing how varied eating challenges can be. Like even within a specific classification, it's so varied from person to person. It's so personal and
Yeah.
it's so heart-wrenching too because you can see that it's a struggle for that person, and as a parent watching it, and I even have a friend whose daughter's been going through the anorexia version, so we've been able to see similarities and the differences and challenges. So I mean, with my son, we've dealt a lot with the mental challenges about not good enough and about I can't eat food, and so those kinds of like I just can't make myself do it, whereas hers more is my body feels like this and my body feels like that, so she's dealing with a different side of mental health and physical health. Even if we still are, it's all food related, like it's all related to how that affects your body. But
Mhm.
one of the questions I have is how do parents and caregivers kind of be aware of things with like the awareness and early signs or things to watch for? I know with us, I mean, I said in retrospect, I could see all these things, right? You know, my son
Mhm.
passed out twice, and that was very strange. I just thought he stood up too fast or whatever. He was
Mhm.
very lethargic, like to the point that I'm like, this lazy teenager is not getting out of bed. But it really was that his body wouldn't work. Like he couldn't make it work. He couldn't,
Yeah.
his brain was struggling. It was very slow and sluggish, and his feet were turning blue. And, you know, these things that I never would have put together thinking, oh, this is because you haven't had enough food. Like just, so I guess I always want to ask what recommendations do you have for parents to be aware of as they're looking at their kids and if they're concerned, like what things would be, oh, maybe I should think about that.
I feel like the first thing and the hardest thing is to like become informed. And so like your
Mhm.
listeners are doing this now, like listening to this podcast, like ideally you're someone, I guess, who is liking the intake of information in this audio format. And like that's great that people are taking time to become informed because the like I mentioned a little bit earlier, I feel like there's so much misinformation that can exist around the topic, whereby now it can feel like stuck, and there's a lot to like make someone doubt if what they're seeing is what they're seeing.
Mm,
And I think one of the reasons why NEDIC like tries our best to still be active on social media as much as we can, even though that's still a struggle for lots of reasons, is to be like, that's where people are, right? And like, how do
mhm,
we give people the sources of information where they are? I think it because everyone has an opinion about food weight and shape, I think it can be really hard just to find information about what that means. And so taking steps to talk to people who feel like they're helping you feel empowered instead of like whispering like sweet solutions or magic solutions, I feel like
yeah.
that's a easy like yellow flag of like uh-oh, because generally speaking, the absolutes or the unbalancedness of that should tell you that like it's usually not that easy. And we want to find information sources that value nuance, that give you specific information and then lets you take what you want to take and like leave what doesn't fit your situation. And so to me, I think that's step number one. I think to your point, Lisa Marie, step number two is like, yeah, like almost like don't get in your own way of like don't beat yourself up when changes have happened and you don't notice it because it is like really hard, I think, to connect those dots when they're happening in the moment. There can always be hundreds of different reasons, thousands of different reasons why a kid might be behaving the way that they're behaving. But I think getting a chance to notice a change and that it's a change for your child, like it might not
Mm,
necessarily match really well to like a symptom list, but it's something that feels different. Those are what I call like signs for curiosity, like ways in which is like, how do I just get the most curious about what's going on? I think can be really hard for a parent or a teacher, and in homeschool, I feel like you're doing both,
mhm,
but like not come into that with like a solutions focused mindset, right? I think it's
mhm,
really easy to sometimes fall into that. And I think wherever possible, trying to use your curiosity to just like ask open-ended questions and like create a space where your child can potentially share if there's been other things going on. We do parent panels with schools and publicly funded school boards, and one of the things that a parent has always said on one of those that's really stuck with me is like take advantage of the times where you have been able to have serious conversations with your kids and like use that moment as your time to like ask a curious question. And for her, it was like she has so much more success rather than like sitting at a dinner table having a conversation to
mhm.
like have the conversation on a drive or on a walk or coming up before bed and like going into their room privately and like getting a chance to have that conversation if that's what you're used to. Like you know this as your family, whenever you've been able to have a more serious conversation, use that opportunity instead of trying to like force something that's gonna might feel awkward because to the person directly impacted, they're already probably looking for any reason to like not have that convo
Run
or
away.
like
Yeah.
run away from that.
Yeah. I don't know. I've heard before girls like to have face-to-face conversations and guys like to have shoulder-to-shoulder conversations. I know with my son, when I need to
Mm,
have deep conversations, you can lock him in a car and drive him somewhere. He can't escape. No, he doesn't want to anyways. But,
yeah.
that way you don't have to, it's not as pressured, right? It's just a casual chat and, they don't have to make eye contact with you if they're feeling uncomfortable, but they can still be open and vulnerable. And I found that to various appointments and various things, we've had a great opportunities to have deep conversations that we probably wouldn't have had if we'd been hanging out at home and he had his computer distracting nearby or a sibling running by or whatever. So I
Yeah.
agree with that. Being open in conversation and just being aware of what their life like. Yeah, I like the idea of when you see something that's not typical for your child to just be curious like
Mhm.
what's going on. Yeah, there's quotations around the typical for for the air quotes that you can't see, but just being aware of what changes have happened and talking to your kids about it because maybe they haven't noticed either, or because it's not like my son would be able to just find, "Well, I feel terrible," or whatever. It was just these things. It's like, why are your feet purple? Like that was an interesting day conversation we had, and as I said, in
Yeah.
retrospect, I can see how the lines all lined up. And your point about not beating yourself up, I have to say, as a mom who's had to deal with this, that first initial, "What did I do wrong?" right? What did
Mhm.
I do? Like
Oh,
I
it's tricky.
failed my kids. Like I should have done this and I should have done that. One common phrase I like to say is don't should on yourself. Thanks my mother-in-law for that one. Don't should on yourself because honestly, what's going on with your child is going on with your child. Yes, in retrospect, I can see all the dots that connected with each other, but I couldn't at the time. And I didn't know better, even though I was familiar enough with some of the context of ARFID because I had been researching it for my older child. How it manifested in another child was completely different than what I thought I knew. Right. So
Right.
just and everyone says it, don't blame yourself, but I remember crying in the car on the way to the hospital because I'm like, what have I done? Right? Really? It's
Yeah.
taken a lot of process as a parent to be able to be like, this is an us problem and let's see how we can work on this together, right? So just support systems with your kids.
Right. Trying to
Mm.
keep the door open as much as you can, like trying to keep the lines of communication open as much as you can. Because I feel like on the other side, I feel like for folks directly impacted, I think sometimes the discourse can also feel really like blamey for them. Like I feel
Mm.
like for them, I've heard many folks with lived experience be like, well, I don't want to like burden my mom or
Mm.
dad, or like like maybe this is true, maybe this isn't true. Like they're caught in their own like messaging that they've heard around food, weight, or shape, or like they have their own emotional feelings about what that is and what that isn't. And I think, however, now we can make space to like have that conversation as on equal grounds as we can.
Yeah, and learning to accept their perspective. Like it does it
Yeah.
I can see how they feel that way. I may not agree with the way they feel that way, but I can accept that my child feels this way or this person feels this way. And to be able to understand from their perspective, okay, so this is hard for my child. Like whether that's they're seeing themselves as fat, even though on my perspective, I'm like, holy crap, child, if you get any skinnier, you're gonna be like a skeleton with skin. Like that's what my perspective is. But from their perspective is I'm huge. Like I can't figure out. And so being able
Right.
to you don't have to be like you're dumb like what are you thinking but being like I can understand I
Yeah, like
see
where'd
that
those
you
messages come from? Like, have you
right yeah
heard that from other people around you? Like, what do you think about what being healthy is or isn't? Or like, what have you heard around the links about body size and health? And like just getting
mm,
a chance to like ask questions. They don't have to be those exact words, but like ask questions of that ilk to get to hear their perspective and hear where they come from. I feel like keeps that line of communication as open as we can. Like we want to play catch, like let's
yeah
keep
yeah
tossing the ball for as long as we can.
so then I guess the next question is do you have any recommendations of healthy ways to actually talk to kids about their bodies and just and food because I know there's a lot of messaging about good food bad food and that's a big struggle like makes me
Mhm.
angry sometimes. I'm like calories are calories we just need to get them in I don't care if it's ice cream every meal like we just need to get them in but people go ice cream's bad right and then that messaging gets stuck in their heads so and the other thing that I've noticed in our house is for example because food and because weight and because that has become somewhat obsessive with medical needs for what we have with one child, it's
Yeah,
impacting other kids in the house, right?
right.
So I may have a younger sibling jump on a scale, which we don't keep a scale. We don't really talk about weights, but I've seen them jump on a scale and be like, "Oh, I really need to stop." I'm like, we're not starting another whole thing here. So it's important. How what are some healthy ways that we can really have these conversations about body and about food without harming or unintentionally causing insecurity?
I mean, I think the start on this, like, I feel like we could talk forever about this one point, but the start on this, like, one of the services that NEDIC operates around the country is a national toll-free helpline and a live chat
Mm,
service that's anonymous and confidential, so anyone across the country can reach out. You don't have to have a diagnosis. We've like talked to kids as young as 8. We've talked to like older folks who have had diagnosed eating disorders for like 50 years. Like it's a service that anyone can access. You talk to a trained support worker. And around a quarter of the people who reach out to us are parents and caregivers or people supporting somebody else. So spouses, coaches, teachers included in this bucket. And one of the things that I feel like we hear really often among that group of folks who contact us is the ways in which the suggestion that I would have is to like role model as much positive behavior as you can for yourself. But what that often leads to is that us as parents, us as people who are helpers, all have our own relationship with body image or eating that like
mhm.
we might not have had our own time to get to process through, right? It's almost like through pseudo proxy that now that our loved one is going through this, that now it's an opportunity for us to also have a spotlight on that relationship with us. And I just want to name that like that can be really hard. It can feel really impostery to feel like I have no idea what I'm doing with my body or what I'm doing with my body
Mm.
image or my eating. How am I supposed to now help another person? And I think I want to send that message first that like these are conversations we're happy to have on Helpline and chat. Like I feel like it's I want to say that it's definitely not just you, that there's definitely hundreds, thousands of people who are also struggling with that same thing. And I think we it's really hard to role model unless we feel really in tune with our own thoughts and feelings and behaviors about what these are. We're not chasing any kind of perfection. We're not saying that everyone has to do things the right way all the time, because I think right is really subjective. But it's how do we make sure that you're able to catch what's free, what's you, and then be able to hold that so that way you can hold what is them, and what
Mm.
is your child or the person you're supporting. Because things get messier when it feels like those two things aren't as distinct. When we call that like a blending, it feels like our own shit is also impacting the shit that we're hearing. And then that makes it really difficult. So, like, step number one is role modeling. And by virtue of that, how do we make sure that you feel okay with the way you're thinking about information around your body and your eating? Because I think that'll help us be a better supporter of somebody else. That's not my like side way of avoiding giving more practical things, but I think it's just an important context to give first before we jump into the practical stuff.
I totally agree because I even catch myself, right? Because I'm like, oh, I know I'm more overweight for my age than I should be, and I feel sluggish in my body, and I really want to. But I've had to learn to say I don't want to lose weight. Like I'm not. I'm on a diet, or those things. Those word choices can be negative impacts. So it's become I want to get strong in my body. I want to be able to eat foods that energize my body or give me the nutrition that I need, as opposed to saying I'm cutting out carbs or I'm cutting out whatever. Like I maybe I do that. I don't know. It just depends on what I choose to do, but I don't need to use the language behind that that causes my kids to think, "Oh, I should be on a diet or whatever." It's I want to be strong in my body. I want to be able to be moving without hurting. I want to be able to walk around the block without feeling tired. Those kinds of different practical goals, as opposed to I want to be 150 pounds or whatever your particular goal is. And
Right.
you can have those goals in your head. Just make sure they're not like verbalized in conversation because that can cause challenges, right? I love that.
Yeah.
That the role model one is a hard one, and that I agree. That was a big thing. I never really thought about the language that I used or what I was doing in my day to day and be like, "Oh man, I just ate like 5 cookies. Like I'm a terrible person." Right? That's those language things that you don't even think about that you do every day. So that's a
Yeah.
very valid point is that learning how to be a positive role model related to food and your body is important and a challenge. So that was valid, yeah.
Right. And like hopefully I would say like those us having those own internal thoughts and feelings about it while okay are like now opportunities for us to get help or support to get to talk about these things in ways that can like free you. Like I think
Mhm.
like naming foods as bad or like sinful or junk or like feeling guilt about that, like to me that's so like restraining. Like it feels like I can't move or live freely in the world. And I would say to everyone out here that like I think we all deserve freedom. Like we all
Mhm.
deserve the chance to live free from those kinds of pressures and like feel valued as human beings beyond how we look like or to beyond what we eat, like
Mm.
based on qualities about who we actually are as human beings. One of my practical suggestions that I feel like I share often is if you feel like especially like diet culture goals, what I call diet culture goals, like disordered eating message goals, will often tend to be very quantitative. And that's not saying all quantitative goals are diet culture goals, but it'll tend to be that that'll be a majority of what the goal is. And I think there's always opportunity to like add some freedom and some flexibility in when we try to make that quantitative goal as qualitative as we can too. And like what I hear you just sharing, Lisa Marie, I feel like you modeled that really well. Like you moved a very like diet or like weight-based goal into something that like gets to how you actually feel in your body. Like, are you feeling like your body's able to move the way you want it to move? Are you feeling strong and energized and excited in your body instead of feeling sluggish or inflexible or whatever, right? Like those are qualitative things that you can add on to the quantitative of, and that means I'm going to go outside 3 times a day or whatever you're going to do, right?
Mm.
I think like adding some balance, that's important. The other thing that I'll say from like a qualitative place when it comes to food messages is I think especially with more and more Canadians, I think like struggling with food security writ large, whether that's the cost of food or whether that's all the time that it comes into cooking and the skills of that and having the ability to do that on a regular basis. I think it's so easy to get really like blamey and shamey about what kinds of food we have access to
Mm.
and then what are we feeding our kids and what are we eating. I just want to let everyone know that like the basic for any child is just making sure that they get enough food. So what Lisa Marie was saying earlier on like a calorie is a calorie. Like let's just make sure that they're getting energy in so that way their brain and their body can function, even if it's constantly Cheerios or goldfish or ice
Mhm.
cream or like whatever it is. Getting enough food is like the bottom of our food justice pyramid. Like you got to make sure you do that. It's only when we have enough that then we can start to make decisions about like enjoyment and pleasure and the ethics of what we eat and like making sure we have all the fun nutritional balance that we should have. And that includes both like biological nourishment, but also things I think like cultural and spiritual nourishment. There are
Mm.
sometimes for many of our like holidays and celebrations that the food that might be in front of us might not actually be the most biologically nourishing for us, but like they're spiritually nourishing, like they are culturally nourishing. They help us feel like we can connect to things that are larger than just our individual beings. Like those are healthy in their own way.
Mm.
It's just how do we broaden health? But all of those things add on to the base of the pyramid, which is getting enough. And unless we have enough, I like don't want there to be too much stress about the higher levels of the pyramid because
Mm.
enough is most important. And like for kids who are restricting, for kids who do have RFID or whatever, right? Like the getting enough is the fight. Like that's going to be a journey in and of itself. And like once we have that, then we can add on the other pieces.
As a mom whose kids are very restrictive, if I hear one more person tell me that my kid shouldn't be on a white food diet, I may smack them. Because, frankly, if my kid will literally eat Cheerios and white bread, and once in a while I can get a yogurt, which has, the protein things and whatever, with my oldest who's always struggled with food, we've learned to provide balance between the regular stuff and find the foods that fill in the gaps. Like maybe he'll never be the kid that can eat an entire bowl full of unique salad ingredients, but he can eat cucumbers.
Mhm.
He'll eat cucumbers and he'll eat a yogurt and he'll eat a piece of cheese. Like we've added things to his food intake that allow him to have more nutrition than when he was little and he literally ate Cheerios. That's all, right? So just understanding that food choices for certain people may not look like what your idea of what food should look like. Don't judge, man. Don't judge. You don't know what that family's going through. Let me tell you, this has been like 20 years of struggling with food at our house. I'm tired. If my kids could just eat food, I'd be the happiest mom ever. But I've had to learn how to be okay with life not, I have to make 5 meals or I have to whatever, variations of the meal. And it's
Right.
exhausting. And I
Different things
hate
for
that.
different
But
kids. Yeah.
uh,
Like,
I hate that. But if my kids will just eat what I told them to eat, well, good for you. Mine don't. So I'd rather them be alive than have the power struggle over what eat the food I made, right? So that's a challenge.
yeah.
But I like that pyramid idea. And yes, I was talking to somebody recently about the whole holidays thing and about how when we're in that mindset of I shouldn't be eating sweets or what, blah, 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 we take
Mhm.
away all the enjoyment from these opportunities. Like, why can't I have a piece of pumpkin pie? We as a society use food as a social interaction so much. And if we're punishing ourselves by saying this is restricted for me or whatever, we're not really showcasing how to be good, positive, healthy eaters for our children either, right? So yeah.
Even like food is a reward. Like I hear a
Mm.
lot when I get to talk to teachers of like then that's like pizza day or pizza lunches or whatever. I've tried to encourage teachers to like make the fun something that has nothing to do with food. Like we're watching a movie and then like we're having pizza or whatever with that. Reward and punishment are like two sides of the same coin. And ultimately,
Mm.
like we just don't want to be associating like a moral value judgment with the food that we're eating because there's just more to it than that.
So then, if as a parent you suspect your kid has an eating disorder, like you've seen things that make you question or disordered eating challenges, it doesn't even need to be a diagnosed, like you're just like,
Hmm.
I'm not really sure, like whatever. What
Hmm.
steps should they take from there? Like, what do you recommend they do?
Yeah, I think like just to know that I think getting health literacy about these sorts of challenges can be really hard. I feel like a lot of parents have had to do a lot of self-advocating within their own work and talking to other people in their network and their Facebook groups and what have you to be able
Mm.
to get stuff. If you reach out to the NEDIC helpline or live chat, we have the ability to help navigate you through to different support services that might be helpful for you or your family. Things that range from like dipping your toe into the water of like thinking about a support group or peer support that can be accessed for free to things like professional help from a therapist or a dietitian who has more training in eating disorders to something like, oh, what does a hospital visit look like and what are things to ask for? And sometimes, and this can sound kind of weird, but like, how do we educate our medical professionals about what's going on? Because sometimes even them, we think that they know everything. And I think to give them credit too, from a place of non-blame, like they have so much to stuff into their brain.
Oh yeah.
Healthcare providers on average get less than 5 hours of training on eating disorders over the course of their education. That's not a lot of time. You all have spent 40 minutes or so or whatever listening to this. It doesn't mean that we're all now one-fifth of a doctor, but it means that just like sometimes we might have to be the one to help our healthcare provider understand what to do because they might not know. And that can sound kind of weird, but we have resources to be able to help like a checklist that you can take into a medical appointment, or we have a 4-page guide for medical providers on like what tests do I order to support a patient with an eating disorder. Things like that are sometimes just like important parts of what accessing help looks like. I think it's really common for people directly affected if you're the one who's noticing versus like they have come to tell you. If you're the one who you feel like you've noticed and you bring it up, anger and denial are like really common responses. And that doesn't, I think it's a really valid response. I think people could be living with these symptoms for like such a length of time that it's become the norm for them. They might be
Mm.
experiencing benefits from the effects of their eating disorder behavior, like getting positive comments from friends about like, oh, you're watching what you eat, or like, oh, your body's looking good, or whatever. Like those things can be really confusing for a young person who now is
Mm.
like, well, I'm doing something right then. Or they might just be like really scared and like don't know what change looks like or not feel like they're gonna get support for their healing. To say that like a negative response is okay, it's not an attack on you. You can try your best to name that you're concerned, that you care about them, that you're not critical of them, but you can still be firm with your explanation, like that you want to have an honest conversation about what's been going on, that you don't want to make assumptions, and you want them to be able to feel like you can work on this together, that they can lean on you for support, and that together with your two brains or multiple brains, like you'll be able to come up with maybe better solutions than just one person. I think sometimes it might be to like you might have to give them some time, and I think sometimes it can be scary for parents to like suddenly be aware of something, especially if it does feel like a physical symptom and like something medical, like feet turning blue or fainting or whatever. So like it might not feel like you have as much time, but I think if you do feel like you do, I think know that that's, I think, a really normal thing. Like letting them know that you're available, encouraging them to share, but like letting them go at their pace. And if it feels like you do have to like take a stance around medical risk and bringing someone to a hospital or bringing someone to an appointment, like being able to let them know that as like clearly and transparently as to why you're doing that, and that it's out of making sure that you want to make sure that their body will be okay, and like you're trying to minimize the long-term risk of something. Like
Mm.
sometimes those are hard emotional conversations to have, but like wherever possible, like being transparent and trying to give as many choices, I think still maximize the chance of like not being an enemy to your child, like feeling like you're on the same team as much as you can.
Yeah. I know in one of the groups I was in, they were talking about people who are struggling with eating disordered eating, their brains are obviously different than yours, but they can be very angry and very reactive and and often when they're malnourished, for example, their brain doesn't function particularly at normal, quote, quote, whatever that means. It can be very hard to have conversations because they're like always yelling or always reactive or always whatever. And
Mhm.
it can become very personal. But the thing that they said in this group that always stuck with me is I call that one Ed, which stands for eating disorder. And I'm dealing with Ed and I have to counter it with Ed. It's not my child who is attacking me. It's Ed that's attacking me. So right, so that you can differentiate and not feel a negative reaction to your particular child. They are struggling like it's a monster that's attached themselves to my child, and this is Ed. So I thought that was an interesting kind of analogy because you don't want this to impact your relationship with your child long term. It's not your child who's reacting; it's the struggle that they're having that's attacking you because it doesn't want to let go. And as you said, the I didn't think about how the positive feedback that they're getting can really be in conflict with the
Mhm.
the messaging that you're trying to get through that this isn't healthy for you. Like, I really
Mhm.
just want you to be healthy and safe. And yeah, it's
Mhm.
hard. It's hard, man. Being on the parent side's been a tough journey. I will admit that. And so I would never wish an eating disorder or eating challenges on anybody because it's not like a you're sick, let's take you to the hospital and get you better. It's like a long process and it's every day, all the time, conscious efforts and continued work. And it recovery is possible. I'd like to say we haven't got there yet.
It's
You're not
full of the ups and downs too. Like
Yep.
recovery also isn't like I think sometimes an issue with the recovery discourse is then it like insinuates that there's a recovered. And I think
Mm,
for some people that's true. Like I want people to know that like full and lasting recovery in quotes, whatever that means, like is possible. There are people who we talk to who don't experience symptoms anymore.
mhm,
And there are other people who just like learn how to manage or navigate their symptoms and it just feels less intense, you know? And but it doesn't mean that it ever maybe fully goes away. And it's not like a hip replacement where suddenly now it's replaced and you're healed. Like
yeah.
sometimes there are lingering things that happen or during times of stress or during a global pandemic or whatever. Like there are times when things can flare. Your story is your story. I feel like in the ed analogy that you gave, I've heard that too, and I've heard that being helpful, the like externalizing of the eating disorder as something that's separate from your child. And like another approach, if it feels like ed isn't working for your in particular situation, to like also try to say, because this is something impacting the individual human, how can we hear ed out as much as possible? Like, how can we
Mm,
hear and still give a voice that doesn't have to be symptom voices or an acting out voice or whatever, but like what's been going on that led to Ed feeling like Ed had to be really active. And
mm,
like it might feel weird. I'm not necessarily saying like you have to like trust the eating disorders message because I think the message can be really warped. But I think it does sometimes feel like you're able to get on a level playing field when you're able to make a like supportive, calm space for the voice to come out without it having to be at like the dinner table or like
yeah, yeah.
at a moment of intense emotion, right? Like being able to model to Ed that like you don't need to be angry or upset to like have your message be heard and like let's
Mhm,
hear what's going on and what's my child how come they feel so intense about this thing what like
mm,
underlying thing is going on here sometimes that can be helpful too. Those are just different approaches, but I think all in a similar way of trying to just externalize the behavior and like create a team like atmosphere to be able to support. Because I think matching yelling with yelling, while I think I understand where that comes from, only leads to further escalation. And like, I think it's a-okay for parents to make sure that they have the support that they need. If you have a spouse that you're co-parenting with, if you have friends or family members, if you need to access a support group for yourself, if you sometimes just need to take a step away, grab some water, collect yourself, and come back. Like, those are all things that I think are important to do because it's easy to feel like you're getting like dyed to the color of the eating disorder. And it's
mm.
important for you to be your own color.
And it's okay to go get help, like, whether
Yeah.
that's with NEDIC or whether that's therapy or just having someone to talk to. I agree, because it can be a very tiring and hard role to play to be a support person to somebody who's struggling with and wanting to recover or not wanting to recover or just those things. It's really important that you take care of yourself too, because it's a heavy weight to it can be, let me just say, it can be a heavy weight to carry if you're the support person for somebody who's going through this challenge.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the eating disorder week is and when it is and what the purpose of that week is?
Sure thing. So Eating Disorders Awareness Week in Canada is February 1st to 7th every year. And it's just a week of public action that we have to raise awareness and foster greater understanding about eating disorders, to challenge stigma, and to try to break barriers that can prevent access to care. Like we all know, eating disorders affect people. They're as diverse as the people that they affect. All
Mm.
genders, all sexual orientations, ages, socioeconomic classes, abilities, races, backgrounds, sizes can impact anyone in Canada. And what happens from coast to coast to coast every year is that a group of community agencies and eating disorder advocates will come together to see like what kinds of needs are we all hearing in our local jurisdictions and how do we put together educational materials and host events that members of the public can attend to learn more, whether that's someone who's directly affected, whether that's a caregiver or someone supporting someone affected, or whether you're a healthcare provider or someone who's working in a caring profession who wants to now improve what you're doing in profession. So this year's theme is called Embracing Possibilities, and it's meant to highlight the power of community-driven solutions that aim to transform the eating disorder care landscape to illuminate pathways that are equitable, accessible, and inclusive for all. And so what that looks like this year is we've got a support group-a-thon over the course of the week where people can attend. There's, I think, 17 local different events that people can attend online or in person for free to be able to get some support about underserved topics around eating disorders. That can include stuff for like kids who are neurodivergent and have an eating disorder, or people who have substance use concerns who have intersected now with our eating or appetite, just as examples. We've got some webinars around creating more equitable spaces for eating disorders. We've got some training opportunities for care providers to learn a bit more on how to be more eating disorder informed in your care. And then we've also got some social media materials that shine a light on the updated prevalence and severity and like some did you know kind of myth busters for people to
Mm.
share, as well as some resource spotlights. So not just what NEDIC does, but organizations across the country in local jurisdictions who run things like online programs, peer support programs, caring about early intervention, teacher trainings, healthcare support, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can find all of that information at nedic.ca/EDAW, EDAW for Eating Disorders Awareness Week. And we hope that there's something in there that people feel like they can maybe reach out and attend.
Fantastic. Great. And you just gave the website, so that's good. That's where people can find NEDIC in general, NEDIC.ca. And that I know that you guys have tons of information about what does an eating disorder look like, what to do for caregivers, or if you think you have it yourself. I know there's lists of therapists and dietitians and all kinds of amazing resources on there. So if you're looking for help and support, that's a great first step. I know I've been able to take advantage of the live chat when I've been like, I don't know what to do anymore. Let's just ask. See, somebody else has. I need an outside voice who's not a chat GPT, and that's helpful for me. So, one last question. So, what one message or takeaway from this conversation would you hope that parents or caregivers remember from this conversation?
I'm gonna cheat and have two. One
Okay.
of them is that eating disorders are everyone's business. That like thank you for taking your time out of your day to listen to this conversation, to try to get informed and to hopefully have some takeaways that you can maybe think about for either for your own life or for people around you. And two, but based on Lisa Marie's first comment around the ways like she was talking about her family and experience, to know that like bodies are really resilient, like human beings are really resilient. Like we have the ability to go through things like this and still come out the other side and be wiser or like have a perspective as a result of it. sometimes people might use words like healing or change or recovery, but I think it doesn't have to be those things. It can be whatever fits for you or your family. But to know that I think like we can do it, that we can go through those sorts of things. And like humans, I don't know, our bodies have evolved over thousands of years or whatever to get to this point where we're at in 2025. Like I think we can handle it. And I think it's just easier to handle stuff like this when it feels like we have community support, when it feels like we can talk about it openly. And so I hope that this is an opportunity for you to have some conversations with people in your life in that way.
Perfect. Thank you so much for giving me your time. I appreciate you joining us and sharing your expertise and knowledge with us, because I think this is an important conversation that doesn't get talked about enough. So I'm glad that we can add it to our resource library here at the Canadian Homeschooler. And thank you so much, Ary, for joining me, and all the best with your work moving forward.
Thank you so much for having me and for making space for the conversation.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Canadian Homeschooler Podcast. I hope this conversation helped you if you are worried about or dealing with eating challenges in your home. In the next episode, I'll be joined by Teresa Weidrich from Homeschool Mama Self-Care, and we're going to talk about burnout and the winter blahs. If you have any feedback, ideas for topics, or people we should try to connect with for interviews, please let us know. And don't forget to share with your Canadian homeschooling friends. Thanks so much for joining in. Until next time, happy learning.